Que nada, sin mucha presentación, bestseller del libro de Design for Hackers, un excelente conferencista que viene de Estados Unidos y que va a hablar inglés con nosotros, con un poquito de español por ahí mezclado. Y esta es una de las charlas que yo también más estaba esperando, porque ¿se acuerdan que yo no sé ni diseñar ni programar? Capaz que con un poco de las ideas que él me saca, mis diseños van a ser más lindos, voy a poder presentar cosas. Así que sin más presentación, les quiero dejar a David. Por favor, bienvenido a México y esta es tu audiencia.
Gracias. Hola, ¿cómo estás? ¿Todo bien? ¿Todo bien? Disculpe, pero no puedo presentar en español hoy, pero en 1 o 2 años, quizás. Yes. So, how many people here are designers? Okay. And how many people here have ever had to design something? Anything? Design anything? Good. I think that we're all designers. We're all going to have to be designers eventually. And so I talk about design, I deconstruct design so that you can see design in a new way and that you can hopefully become a better designer yourself. So I wrote this book. It's called Design for Hackers. And I've got one other question. Have any of you ever been in a conversation before where somebody said that something had too much white space or not enough white space? Okay, well, that completely ruins my theory. Entiendo? Entiende? Entiende. Entiende. Well, let me tell you a story. My very first job, like real job, I was an intern at an advertising firm. And I was designing a newsletter, and I went ahead and made your standard sort of 3-column newsletter, or 2-column newsletter, and I presented it to the client. And the client said, "This has too much white space." And so I went back, and I made it 3 columns this time. And I put all that information in there and really crammed it all in there. And then I took it back to the client, and the client said, "This doesn't have enough white space." Now, it did not help that my client was Goldilocks. Do you guys have Goldilocks? No Goldilocks? Goldilocks and the 3 Bears? Okay, that doesn't work, does it? But pretty much everybody in this room, I would assume, has been in a conversation at some point where they were designing something and somebody, maybe even you, said, "This has too much white space," or "This doesn't have enough white space." And actually, never in the history of the world, I think, has anybody ever looked at a design and said, "You know, what I like about this design, the white space. The fonts are ugly, it's in Comic Sans. The color makes me want to puke. But the white space, mwah, it's perfect." Nobody ever says that. But yet, white space is this important thing that, when it's not right, we notice. When it's, is this where the camera is? Yeah. Oh, okay. So do I have to stand here the whole time?
No, you can go over there.
Okay, where's the limit? Is it
The limit is
where the computer is? I can't go where the computer is, basically.
from here to here.
Okay. All right, so, I'm good. So, anyway, white space is this important thing, but nobody ever talks about it quite when it's right. This was really interesting to me. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I grabbed a bar of deodorant. This deodorant, Mitchum brand deodorant, and the tagline on it is, "So effective you could even skip a day." Don't know why you'd want to. But everything that you design is exactly like this bar of deodorant. So forget about everything that you think that you know about design. Forget about CSS. Forget about jQuery. Forget about A/B testing. Forget about colors. Everything that you design is exactly like this bar of deodorant, because this bar of deodorant has just information on it, and there's a hierarchy to that information. You know, the title is big and it looks more important, and the tagline is a little bit less large. And so I actually took all the information off of this deodorant bottle, and I conducted experiments in white space, which is probably why I didn't have very many girlfriends in college. But I conducted experiments in white space where I would just take the information, use just one font, use only black and white, and just use white space to try to change the way that information was laid out. I would do experiments a little bit like this. And so this was 10 years ago, and I want to present these sort of findings to you today. And so I've used all this knowledge that I gained from this experimentation. I've used it working at an architecture firm. I've used it working at startups in Silicon Valley. I've used it in weekend coding projects. And whether I'm applying a sign to the side of a granite building, or I'm developing a quick style sheet for a hackathon or something, these white space, the things I've learned about white space have always paid off. And so my talk is going to be in sort of 3 layers. I'm going to talk a little bit about theory, so if you're high or something, then this will be perfect. But grab yourself a cup of coffee, because there will be some things where I talk a little bit more practically, be talking about it in layers. And so some of the things I talk about in the theory part of the talk, I will revisit later talking in practice, and then also there will be some examples in the end. So in Japanese, there's a word called ma, and I think it really describes best what white space is, or I imagine it would. I'm not Japanese, because there's not really a direct translation. In English, the closest translation there is the simultaneous awareness of form and non-form is what ma is. So I think that it might be something like, if you were to imagine how a big block of marble will influence the form of a sculpture that's chiseled from it, or the way that the spaces in between notes in a song heighten the presence of the notes themselves, or the way that it'd be far different if I were to tell you you should use white space and you should just about the right amount of white space and don't use too much white space. It'd be far different if I were to tell you that than if I were to tell you that I have a dream that someday the white space in a design will be thought about as much as the rest of the design. So white space is sort of this, to understand white space, you have to understand the simultaneous existence of form and non-form. And the Gestalt psychologists understood this very well. You've probably seen this image before. Do you see 2 faces, or do you see a vase? You might see both. And so everything that we design is like this. We have information, and we have what we normally consider to be content, and then we have all the space in between. And everything we design is really just bits of information that, if we squint our eyes, are just blocks. And there's all this space in between. All this white space. And if you're not thinking about the white space in your design, then you're really ignoring half of your design. So now I'm going to talk about the theory of white space. Texture. Every little piece of information that you have in a layout, whether it's an image, or I'll talk a lot about typography here, whether it's type like this, has a texture to it. So something that's bold has sort of a darker texture to it. Something that's in a light font has a lighter texture to it. If you're to squint, they really just have different levels of visual intensity, different levels of visual weight. So if you squint, it might look a little bit like this. And sometimes one piece of information holds dominance over another. So because the dark word is on the left-hand side, because we read from left to right, we'll probably tend to see that one first. But if we switch sides, then the lighter one might actually hold dominance, or at least be a little bit less unimportant than it was before. And design, usually you're designing something a lot more complicated than this, than just two pieces of information. You have usernames and metadata, and you have titles and subtitles and images and things like that. Most of what you design is going to be way more complex than this. But it all really boils down to playing with what is dominant over the next thing. And to help manage that, it's helpful to understand a little bit about how we perceive things. And you have a lot of complexity to the things that you're designing, so it helps to sort of chunk things together. So there's this concept in psychology of chunking, which isn't necessarily exactly the same thing, but I think that it's helpful to understand it, to understand a little bit how to design things. Just as an example, pretty much anybody in this room, if we were asked to, could count all the dots on this screen. And the way that we would do it is that we would maybe count a few dots in the top left-hand corner, and then we would move our focus of attention and count some more dots. And we keep doing that until we had counted all the dots. And we take that for granted, but there's some people who wouldn't be able to count that. Some people have bilateral damage to their parietal lobe, which actually affects your ability to shift your focus of attention. And so they can only count maybe 2 or 3 objects at a time. And so this sort of, I'm no neuroscientist or anything, but this implies that we can see a couple things at a time with almost like a pre-processing sort of instinct. And when there starts to be a lot more elements competing with each other, it's not quite so easy to keep a grasp on what's going on. And you see this, an understanding of this in really successful interfaces. So for example, the Twitter iPad app, it has this wonderful card metaphor to it. And in its default state, we just have our menu and the timeline, which are really just 2 elements that compete with each other for our attention. But then if we start to dig deeper into tweets, the cards shift, and our visual attention gets taken over by other fields. And then things like this menu become actually smaller as the things that we're paying attention to get deeper into the interface. And if we actually click on a tweet, then we get a really large pane just for that tweet, and everything becomes a little bit more subdominant at that point. So it's constantly managing our attention, our ability to shift our focus of attention. It's constantly giving us just a couple of things to concentrate at a time. And even if you look deeper into different parts of the interface, such as a tweet itself, it's really just a few different elements that are sort of grouped together. So we can constantly shift our focus of attention throughout the interface and dig deeper and see what it is that we're supposed to be looking at any particular time. So then how do you actually manage these relationships between all of these different elements? I'm going to talk a little bit about proportion. So proportion, any object that has more than one dimension to it is said to have proportion. So this square has a 1-to-1 proportion. The other rectangle next to it is twice as long as the square, so it has a 2-to-1 proportion. Now, it's believed that some of these proportions just inherently are more attractive than other proportions, that if you were actually to put different rectangles next to each other, that some people would say that some of those rectangles were actually more attractive than other rectangles. And so the most fabled of all proportions would be the golden proportion, the golden mean, the golden ratio. And a golden ratio rectangle is constructed like this. It has a proportional relationship of 1 to 1.618. And It's a pretty attractive proportion. The Vitruvian Man, which is very famous, is based off the golden ratio. Supposedly, the perfectly proportioned human body is based upon the golden ratio. And then in following, the architect Le Corbusier created an entire architectural scale based off of the proportions of the human body and the proportions of the golden ratio. So there's all these units of measurement you could use to decide how tall to make a wall, or how big to make a door, or how big to make a doorknob. And one of the most fascinating things about the golden ratio is that you can subdivide it over and over again with a square. And if you draw quarter circles in all those squares, you get a spiral such as this, a logarithmic spiral. And this is used really often to say that the golden ratio has some sort of superiority over other ratios. And most often, an example that's used is the nautilus shell. So people say that, look at this nautilus shell, it's got a spiral on it too. So therefore, the golden ratio is this attractive, even divine proportion. But you actually find that if you draw a golden ratio rectangle over the nautilus shell, it doesn't fit at all. It is not even close. I don't know if anybody ever bothered to verify this, but it's not even close. Not very convincing. Well, it turns out there are plenty of other great proportions out there besides the golden ratio. Just for an example, if I took 3 guitar strings, each tuned to D, and I strummed the first one, I would hear a D note. Now, if I took one of them and I made it 3/4 of the length it originally was, I would get a G note, or the 4th note on the major scale. Now, if I took the next one and made it 2/3 the length that it originally was, I would get an A note, or the 5th note in the major scale. Now, this 1-4-5 scale is the basis of 12-bar blues, of most of pop music. In fact, there's a song by a band called the Beatles, ever heard of them, called Twist and Shout, that is this exact chord progression. So my point is, there are a lot of other attractive proportions. So we've got 2/3 here, 3/4, golden ratio. There have been a lot of studies over the years to try to find one that is absolutely more attractive than all the others. And generally, it's been inconclusive. However, it falls somewhere within the range of these. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that there's one proportion that you need to be working with all the time. And I'll go over a little bit how you might actually use these proportions later on in the practice part of it. But it's no surprise that there are other attractive proportions, because a lot of the things that we design for come in a lot of different proportions. So a MacBook Pro is like 1 to 6.25 ratio. And an HD TV is 0.56. A iPhone 4 is 2/3. This presentation itself is actually 3/4. So if you remember, 2/3 and 3/4 were both part of the 1-4-5 chord progression that I showed earlier. So interestingly enough, if you actually take 2 squares, one 75% or 3/4 the size of the other, put them next to each other, and then start drawing quarter turns within these squares, and continue that on and on and on until you have a logarithmic spiral, you come up with a logarithmic spiral that fits the nautilus shell perfectly. I almost fell out of my Aeron chair when I saw this. I just took this image off of Wikipedia. It's public domain, by the way. So there are plenty of other attractive proportions that can be worked with, and I'll be talking a little bit about how to do that later on. So just to summarize some of the theory, in this talk, put down your joint, pick up your cup of coffee because practice is coming. Texture, it affects visual weight. Dominance, all you're doing with design is just trying to work with one element being dominant over another and chunk things together. And the proportions, you don't always have to use the golden ratio. It's not necessarily superior to the others. Now on to practice. There's this idea of clean design that you hear people talk about a lot. They say that a design looks clean. This design looks clean. That's always a good thing, right? Nobody's ever said that this design looks clean and it means something bad that I can think of. So I asked people on Twitter, what do they think was a clean design? So I got a couple of answers. Google's homepage. Okay. Well, there's not a lot of stuff on Google's homepage. It's sort of cheating, I think. And then I also got about blank. Okay. That's totally cheating. That's not even a website. There's nothing there. But these are clever answers. But I think that they point to the fact that a lot of people seem to think that for a design to be clean, there just needs to be less stuff. But you actually find there's plenty of things that are out there that have tons of stuff on them. The New York Times iPad app, as an example, has tons of stuff on it. It has what I would think you would call a clean design. It turns out, though, that cleanliness or simplicity or minimalism, all these words that get conflated, they're not just a visual style. You have to dig into the depth of the complexity. You have to understand the things that you're working with and really communicate those things really carefully. And to do that on a wide scale, it helps to understand on a very small scale that 1 + 1 = 3. No, that's not an error. 1 + 1 = 3. A good little petri dish for understanding this concept, which was introduced by the information design guru Edward Tufte, is tables. Pretty much any program that creates tables is going to create tables that look a lot like this. And it looks like an OK table, but it's got these lines here. They're supposedly to help you connect things, to navigate from one piece of data to another. But you actually find that 1 + 1 = 3. Between each piece of data, there's all this white space, but then there's also this line. And so there's three things. There's the white space between the piece of data and the line, and then we have the line, and then we have the white space between the piece of data and the other line. You actually find you could completely remove all these lines and have a table that works just fine. You can read all of the data. I actually changed the typeface to italic on some of these just to make it look like a different type of data. This seems like really nitpicky thinking, but on a much wider level, this gets to be really big. You get to a very high data-ink ratio when you think this way, and that's another Tufte concept, the idea that each dot of ink, or each pixel, if you will, is communicating something that it's essential, that it needs to be there, that it's actually communicating something. And understanding that and understanding when to use white space instead of something like a rule line can go a long way in creating clean design. So let's see some of this in action with something very familiar. This is what the planet Earth looks like from outer space. If you were to draw a picture of planet Earth with just black and white, you might do something a little bit like this. It doesn't look so bad. You've got this outline. You've got the land is all colored in black. But you could actually find that you can make this much simpler. If you just made the ocean colored in the ocean and left the land completely white, notice there's not even a line there to define the edge of the Earth anymore. You still see it. The way that our brains complete those connections this still reads as planet Earth. And what you'd have is actually the exact same thing as the alerts icon on the Facebook mobile app. So if you communicate really efficiently, you can come up with something that's clean. You can read this icon at a smaller size. 1 + 1 = 3. Now we take advantage of this way that our minds complete these connections when we work with grids. Some of you might be familiar with grids. A grid essentially lines up a bunch of things so that we see like a crisp edge. And this happens over and over again throughout a design so that it's well organized and it looks clean. And grids are often it's just like an equal subdivision of a page. So we might have a 4-column grid or a 6-column grid or an 8-column grid. And it gives us the freedom to break up the page into different areas. Some parts we just use 1 column. This is a 4-column grid, so we're using 3/4 of it, one of the proportions that we talked about earlier, for the main part of the page. And we can break up the grid in a number of different ways. But we don't always have to perfectly subdivide the grid. Twitter, up until recently, was famously designed based upon the golden ratio. The sidebar over here was about 61.8% of the width of the main timeline itself. But to construct a grid on your own, the basic standard grid, you basically define some sort of a margin and then divide it up equally, leaving gutters so that you can put elements along the edges and they don't end up butting up against each other. Then that gives you some guidelines within which you can start to place things, to place information from your design, and then you end up with something that's nice and clean and crisp. Now, not all of us want to bother with building our own grid, so there's a number of different frameworks that are out there. You might be familiar with 960GS or so there's some other ones. The Twitter has one that's called Bootstrap that I think is probably the best one that I've seen in all the research that I've done. I'm going to talk about some of the things that aren't perfect about it, but I don't want it to sound like I'm knocking on it because it is a really good framework. It's just that these frameworks have sort of a one-size-fits-all mentality to them. And they can cause some confusion, some misunderstanding of the grid. See, because the grid is an aid, it's not a guarantee. So just because there's a grid line there doesn't always mean you need to put something directly on it. And just because you have a certain number of columns doesn't mean you have to use all of them in your design all the time. So there's a few gotchas of working with grids and frameworks, such as Twitter's Bootstrap. One of them, probably most important, I think, is column soup. Just avoid column soup. La sopa de column. Bootstrap has 12 columns by default. You can customize it. 12 columns. Now, just because you have 12 columns doesn't mean you should use all 12 columns all the time. It's a one-size-fits-all thing. Those 12 columns are there for you to use, but you have to use a little bit of discretion. So you might find a situation like this. You're designing something. You're off to a good start. You have a couple columns over here, actually 3 columns over here that you're using for a menu, and then another 9 columns, so you've got it divided up by 3/4, that you're using for a main content area. You're off to a good start. Then you divide up underneath that main content area some kind of a larger area of content, and then some news on the side. Not so bad. Then you completely break the grid line that you created when you made the menu item just because you can, and then you really lose it. This sort of column soup happens sometimes when people are working with something like Bootstrap or other grid frameworks, and it can get people into trouble. It doesn't look so good. So some ways to avoid this is to kind of think globally about the way that you're subdividing your page. For example, this grid line that we've created sort of a global definition of this is our menu stuff over here. This is our main stuff. So now all of our main stuff needs to go under here. Pretty much nothing will go underneath this menu until maybe we get to a footer, and then we get all the way wide across it. So that's one way to avoid column soup. Another way is just to not get too granular. If you have 12 columns, maybe pretend you have 4 columns. Pretend you have 3 columns. Pretend you have a little fewer columns, and you have a design that's a little bit less confusing and doesn't get quite so broken up. You don't have the column soup then. One gutter doesn't fit all. Once again, we have an out-of-the-box, one-size-fits-all solution. All the gutter lines in something like Bootstrap are all the same width, which doesn't always make sense. So for example, we've made this sort of global definition here in this design that this is a main content area and this is a menu area. And then we have the same gutter width between our main content area and our menu as we do in some of the content that we have underneath our hero, our little hero hey you thing underneath there. Those are all the same width of gutters. It doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. I think it would make a little bit of sense to actually make that gutter between our menu area and our main content area a little bit wider, which I'm about to do. Here we go. Just make it a few pixels wider. Now we have something that expresses what we're saying about all of our information in our design by the way that we are placing things. It's a little bit more expressive. Also, trust your eyes. Just because there's a grid line there doesn't always mean that that everything needs to line up perfectly along that grid line. So once again, you go to this same layout, and we have this grid line that defines the edge of our little hero hey you splash area, and that same grid line is being used to define the edge of the content that's underneath it. And it starts to look a little bit stale, a little bit rigid and awkward. So we could actually push all that in a little bit. And then it sort of gives this content underneath the splash area sort of a subdominant relationship with this splash area. So now if we add that along with our gutter, we go from this to this, something that's a little bit more expressive of how we have our information organized. Just subtle little tweaks like that can take our out-of-the-box solution and make it a little bit better. Now I'm going to get a little bit deeper into typography here. Managing sizes of type. Sometimes size isn't enough. Right, ladies? Right? No. These are the headers for Bootstrap. These are all the headers. I don't know why anybody even needs 6 levels of headers, but that's what we have in HTML, so that's what we use. And they're really just using size to create these changes, and they're very subtle. There's not a lot being expressed about the different levels of information and importance that we have that we're defining with these headers. I like to use a scale to create a scale of type sizes. It's very easy to use type of any size that you want on the web, and that causes a lot of confusion, especially if you're just starting with designing. There's way more important things to be worried about. So I just create a scale off of 3/4, or you can create one off of 2/3, the 2/3 ratio. This is 7, 9, 12, 16, 21, 28, 37, 50, 67. And that's what I always use. Anytime I need to think about what size of type something is going to be, it's going to be one of those. And if a particular size isn't quite right, then there's other things I can do with the type to further express the information. So just to see how some of these sizes can be used, look at this H1 and this H2, which these are based off of Bootstrap's H1 and H2. Not a whole lot of difference being expressed here. They look like they're almost the same size. But if I use one of those scales and I actually skip a step, say maybe that one of those is 37 pixels and the other one is not 28 but is instead 21, then I start to get some size changes that are a little bit more expressive of the changes in importance of that information. But there's still more that we can do, which I will show you in a little bit. A little bit of horizontal spacing. Some of you are probably familiar with the idea of kerning, which is just managing the white space in between individual letters of type, like this A and this B, very far apart from each other. Put them a little bit closer to each other, and boom, you have your white space a little bit more balanced. This is something you can do on a wider level for actual visual effect when working with all caps. All caps isn't exactly polite when you're using big, large amounts of text, but it's perfectly fine for something like a little header or some metadata or small pieces of text. The Romans used nothing but all caps for quite a while. They did just fine, except for they did collapse after a while. But anyway, so you can actually use letter spacing with all caps like that and space things out. You get a little bit more of a delicate texture to it, and it can help express that information as being a little bit different. Not something you want to do so much with the lowercase type, because these ascenders and descenders, like the bottom of the G, the top of the H, we use those things to read lowercase type, and when you spread them out like that, it just ruins it. So to show that in action, here is the example I was showing before, H1, H2, and you could make it that title all caps and spread them out a little bit. Another popular way to do this is if you have, say, a blog post title and there's some metadata underneath it. We've got a good size change going here, but we haven't really expressed so much how the information is different, how one piece of information is different from another here. So if we do the all caps, spread it out a little bit, we start to get something that feels a little bit more like this is a different type of information. And we've just expressed that just with white space, all the same typeface and everything. And then vertical spacing is another issue. This is what an H3 looks like on Bootstrap. Again, Bootstrap is great. I don't want to look like I'm picking on them, but this is a little too much white space here. And the reason why is because Bootstrap is built on, they use what's called a baseline grid, which is always using a certain unit to manage space. And I'll explain a little bit how exactly they do that. But first I want to introduce the idea of line height. Line height is what manages that vertical white space between individual lines of type. So our font height is these lines here. And then our line height, our fonts live within our line height. And this is what dictates how far apart two different lines of type are. If we increase our line height, then those lines of type get farther apart. So with Bootstrap, with our example here, Bootstrap uses a baseline grid. They're always using units of 9 pixels. So the problem they're having with that H3 is they are using an 18-pixel height type for the H3. So that's 2 units of 9 pixels. They don't want to make their line height 18 pixels because then it'll all be too close together. So they jump up to the next level, which is 27 pixels. It's crazy. It's a lot of pixels. So overall, I just think that the baseline grids are great for really advanced things, for using in print type, but generally I wouldn't worry about them. They're good for lining things up across columns sometimes, but you can often really miss the trees for the forests with baseline grids. So how would we fix this? First of all, I like to work with units called M's. Now, an M is used to be based off of the width of an uppercase M, but that is variable between one font and another, so it's been standardized. It just means the same thing as the font height, but it is a relative measure. So one M is always turns out to be the same as the font height or the font size. And the reason why this is good to work with is because when you're dealing with things like line height, if you have 18 pixel type and you make something 1.5 Ms, if you change that type size to a different size, then that line height adjusts along with it. So using our example from before, which is 27 pixels or 1.5 Ms for our header, we could just make it smaller. Make it 1.2 Ms instead, which breaks our baseline grid entirely, but it looks a lot better, doesn't it? Yeah. So what's the range of line heights that to use? Or, 1.1 M is even more snug. And then because we have a lower line height, we don't need quite as much margin on the bottom, so something like 0.8 Ms is good. And then when we have that type close together, we have the margin bottom there giving us some white space to separate those bullets. We could completely lose the bullets if we wanted to, and they would still read as individual units that are separate from each other but still together, just by using white space. So that is the practice section. Just to summarize, clean design, you need to have data density. Think about what every little pixel is doing. Grid systems are a guide, not a guarantee. Avoid column soup. And one gutter doesn't fit all. And trust your eyes. Everything doesn't always have to be on every single grid line. And then with typography, all those little individual pieces of advice, which I'm actually going to have a kit at the end that you can get downloaded to actually access that information if you didn't write it all down. So now some good examples of white space being used here. I think if there was any logo that were to express best that Japanese word ma, this idea of a simultaneous awareness of form and non-form, I think it would have to be the FedEx logo, which, if you don't know already, between the E and the X, there's an arrow. Salud. There's an arrow there. Very subtle. It's there if you're trying to discover it, but otherwise you probably won't notice. It won't distract you. That's a good example of ma, I think. Now, remember when I was talking earlier about using a wider column for main content area versus your menu? The MCA of Chicago does that with their website. Notice the grid lines for that main content area. Look at the bottom there, those 4 individual pieces. Look at the white space in between those. Now, notice how that white space is a little bit wider between the menu and the main content area. So it really does a good job of defining that these are 2 different pieces of our layout, 2 different sections of information. There's a conference organization, a listing platform called sketch.org, and the founder actually came to one of my earlier white space talks on my book tour, and he told me, oh, I redesigned sketch.org based on your white space talk. So I don't know how well you can actually see some of this, but there is a very slight gray line vertically right there, which I'll totally forgive them for, but it's very light. But they've made the type a lot smaller. Before, they just had this big, huge gray line going around everything. They had these horizontal lines that weren't necessary. Instead, now they've just allowed the white space to talk between time slots to group all that stuff together. They've done a good job with that. And Google has recently redesigned their properties. They look a lot better. You might not like them, but you'd be wrong. And so if you look at their docs, Google Docs, now if you you'll just have a title, and you'll have all black and white type for your menu items. Far different from how it looked before. Things are different when you mouse over them a little bit, but we've all used desktop programs before. We understand what a menu is. We don't need it to have it spelled out for us necessarily with shiny buttons or anything. There's just using the type, the alignment, the scale changes to express all those different pieces of information. And Gmail, done a good job as well. Notice, for example, just this little detail here. See where the title of the email lines up with the avatar, and it's a little bit in. It's not exactly on that left grid line. It's been pushed in a little bit. Versus before, the title sort of lined up with this weird outline that was around all of the different emails. It looked a little strange. It was a little bit off. And so that is everything that you ever wanted to know about nothing. I'm David Kadavy. I've got bonus material for this talk at designforhackers.com, Mejorandola. Mejorandola. Yeah?
Yeah, we can do this. Mejorándola.
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 Perfect. Please.
There you go. I think there's questions. ¿Hay preguntas?
Bueno, vamos a pasar. ¿Quién tiene preguntas para David? Las pueden hacer en español. Aquí tenemos una.
Antes que nada, muchas gracias por la conferencia, estuvo muy buena. He estado estudiando últimamente esta cuestión de lo que es los frameworks basados en grids, Bootstrap en este caso, pienso que también es genial. La pregunta es simple, es relacionada a tipografía. ¿Tipografía con serif o sin sans serif para una mejor, para que sea más legible o más leíble en textos grandes?
Neither is better than the other.
Okay.
Ninguna de las dos.
And so for really large stuff, that's when the fonts that are made for the web don't look quite so good.
Okay.
So your Georgia, which is a fantastic font,
Yeah, actually.
will still look kind of good, but that's when it's like something like a Typekit or Google Fonts API, though none of the fonts they have on there that I've seen are very impressive. And I did a talk at South by Southwest last year called All the Fonts You'll Ever Need. There is also a PDF download that goes along with that. And if you do get the Whitespace kit today at that URL, in the email that the Whitespace kit comes in, there will also be a link to that talk.
Muy bien, David.
Gracias.
We are seeing a lot of sites with responsive design. Are they using the same 12 grid, or they are using another one?
They're using a lot of different grids, and when you are designing for responsive design, sometimes you need to plan to have layouts that are of different types of grids. There is a framework called the Golden Grid System.
Golden Grid System by John Corpy. There's another one with a similar name that gets confusing, and it does a good job of making it changes your grid as you make your layout smaller or larger, but it's very complicated to work with. So it's all going to be a matter of
designing for what is best for those sizes that are important to you.
¿En qué momento se dio cuenta que este elemento de composición de los espacios en blanco era importante para hacer un diseño eficiente? O sea, ¿cuándo y cómo se dio cuenta de esto?
It was 10 years ago when I did those white space experiments that I was talking about, I think. That was when I started to appreciate the complexity of typography and everything that it can do, and to realize that I felt like it would be foolish to worry about colors and all these other things before I understood those subtle things that are going on with alignment and size and bits of white space. So, 10 years ago.
Hace 10 años.
Thank you.
Adelante.
Hello, my name is Edith. I'm
Hola.
from Veracruz. And well, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very inspiring for me and for my job. I'm a graphic designer and well, also a web designer. And well, I would like to ask you about the new site, the new layout of the YouTube site. What do you think about that?
I would recommend, if this interests you, to look at the new YouTube design. Google for YouTube screenshot. Hopefully you'll find an old one. Start to look at the differences, and you'll notice that they're using the white space very efficiently, the type sizes, the vertical spacing. You getting all this? Very, very delicate and lucid design.
Yo quisiera agradecer a David por el aporte. Va a estar por acá y él es muy tímido, le gusta que la gente se acerque y le haga preguntas. Por favor, aprovechenlo. Háganle todas las preguntas que quieran, va a estar por acá todo el resto de la tarde. Y nada, me alegra que les haya gustado la charla. Un aplauso, por favor, de nuevo para David.
Thank you so much. Gracias.